So, we're going to talk about the needs assessment assignment today. And so, as you see on the screen, we're really thinking about how do I know where my campus is and how do I take a pulse on our campus to drive our improvement plan. So, this is one of the first steps in really deciding what we're going to do with our campus improvement plan. So, why do we do an assessment needs for our campus? Like, why do we assess those needs? And it's really to highlight the voices of the ones doing the work. So sometimes we're in the lounge and we can hear some voices quite loudly, or sometimes there's murmurs around the building. And occasionally it can feel like those one or two voices are the strongest. But when you do a needs assessment and you really take a pulse on the entire campus, you can see, is this just one or two people? Is this a specific grade level? Or is this a common pattern across our campus? So it really helps hear from those that are doing the important work. So sometimes we assess our campus needs by just surveying or getting the feedback from teachers, but other times we can also ask other staff members or paraprofessionals or parents just to see, is what we're doing actually working for the people that are invested, all of our stakeholders. So all of this information gives us a pulse on our current reality, because sometimes we think it's one way, and then when we look at the data, we're like, oh wow, actually I didn't consider that. Or sometimes we're like, yep, that's exactly what I was thinking, but now we have data to show why we're making some decisions. It helps with consistency and alignment. So when we're assessing the needs, we can think about, like, how do we set goals that align in a way that every year is adding a layer, some incremental changes across time, and then really document the goals. And this piece is more important for the people almost sitting in their ivory tower, if you will. Showing them that you have data to back up some of the decisions you're making will get you some buy in. So, not from necessarily the staff, although sometimes that does help them as well, but showing your administrators, even the district leaders, like, hey, this is what we found and this is how we're addressing those needs. So the literacy personnel, like all the leaders, are just one piece of this puzzle. So this is something you could do for all areas, but we're going to specifically talk about the literacy element of the needs assessment. So when we're thinking about assessing the needs, there's really 5 steps to do this. The first thing is demographics, and we really want to think about, like, who is our school? What are the students making up our population? This is really important for those that have faced a rezoning, or different clientele have moved into neighborhoods, or there's been a new neighborhood built or a new apartment complex built, and it's changed our student demographics. Sometimes we have to adapt, actually all the time we have to adapt to meet those needs of our families. We can also collect demographic information of our faculty, thinking about, does our faculty represent the students we're serving? And what is the makeup of our campus profile? Are our teachers coming in with years and years and years of experience? Is it varied by level of expertise? What is the range of degrees that are held within our campus? So just to kind of understand, who, not only who are we serving, but who are the people serving those students. And then we collect some feedback, and we'll go in depth mostly on that step. We can compare our feedback with existing data, and then we look across all of that information to determine the strengths and the needs. And then finally, we end with some sort of action plan. So, based on these findings, what are we going to do? So, just to bring back Brene Brown, because I love to reference her since this class is leadership, this is all about listening. And sometimes when we listen, we have to unlearn some pieces. So, especially if we've been in the district a long time, like, I was working with a team recently and we were assessing the needs, and she said, well, I know they're all going to say X, Y, and Z. And they didn't. And she said, oh man, maybe it was just me and my team. So even though she's in this like leadership role now, she drew some assumptions, but by taking a step back and listening and kind of unlearning and thinking about, all right, I can lead by listening to the voices that are sharing right now. So we want to think about, when is it our turn to lead and when do we let others lead? And so this survey can really help us get to that point. So demographics is the first thing, and we kind of already talked about this, but this is just a checklist to think about what type of demographic information am I collecting. So district demographics compared with your campus demographics is something you can usually find on like the school accountability report or your school report card. Um, I like to look for things, not just racial makeup and special populations of students, but I actually like to look at how does our campus compare to where the district is, and also mobility rate of our students, just kind of thinking about like who are these bodies filling our seats. And then again, the professional demographics would be that of your teachers, and your family demographics or your community demographics are those surrounding you. So what does that look like? So for example, I'm working with a school who pull from two very different types of communities that make up their school. So there really is no middle class at their campus. They have a really upper class, students who have $1 million homes. And then they pull from a lot of mobile home communities and RV parks and motels. So their campus demographics looks like about 65% of their students are considered low socioeconomic, but then that other percentage is they're very wealthy. And so it makes for an interesting dynamic across their campus. And how do we support students in building relationships with each other when they come from such different backgrounds? And it's a really fun way to approach inclusion and kindness and friendship and all of these important things that we teach young students. But if we didn't look at the demographics, we wouldn't be able to be so intentional about it. So that's what this is about. And sometimes it's collecting information that is existing, and sometimes we do have to survey that. So we might ask something like, with our teachers, how were they were certified, especially right now. Did you get a traditional certification through an educational preparation program, or did you go alternative certification route? Is this your first career, your second career? Um, how did you enter teaching? How many years have you been teaching? What degrees do you hold? All of this information will shed some light on the teachers that are on your campus. And you can also find information on the TAPER report, especially if it's a TEA school, about teacher turnover rate, which is interesting in a campus to see, are teachers staying or not? So a lot of this information you can find online. I love to present things to, especially to leaders in simplistic formats. So I encourage you to have some exploration with digital tools. I love Canva personally. I think it's so easy to use, and you can get an educator for free, like an educator subscription for free. So you can use Canva and all the premium features just with your school email address. But you can make infographics this way to just show who are the people filling our schools. So this is a great visual tool to add to it. So while this project feels really professional and academic, I really want you to think outside of the box with how you're presenting the information. So we're all collecting the same thing, but like, how are we presenting it? And so you can be creative in that way. So the next step is collecting feedback, and that's really what this needs assessment is about. So the first thing we have to figure out is like, what is my question? What do I want to know? And then how am I going to present that information? And so there's a couple ways we can do this. First of all, we really want to think about, for literacy, do we want to know about the entire program, a specific piece of the program? So you might think about, okay, we've done reading academies, so maybe I'll filter into those foundational skills to see, specifically asking questions about the things the reading academy presented. Or maybe you already know that there's a component like writing missing on your campus, and you can filter the questions to ask about that. You don't want to necessarily lead the questions, but we're just funneling down to like, what is it that I really want to know? You also could think about, do I want a big picture so I can figure out those gaps? So you might ask about all areas of literacy, but since we are collecting feedback from teachers who are super, super busy, we just don't want it to take much of their time. So keep in mind the time and the length of the survey. And then the format, this goes in, okay, how are we going to distribute this? And so are we going to do a survey that's like formal? Maybe we can tack it on to the end of a faculty meeting or something like that. It could be something we distribute, and if you respond, you get X amount of jeans passes, however you're going to incentivize them to respond. I really like just doing it when I have teachers all in a room personally. I just tell them, like, I'm trying to gather some information. It's anonymous. I really want your voices to be heard, and I want everybody's voices to be heard. So we're going to take the last 10 minutes to fill this out. Typically, I have a good success rate when I do it that way. So one thing I do with teachers actually all the time now is this chalk talk using the compass method. So it really helps us orient, and it's very informal. So while a survey can feel very rigid, this can feel like a talking point instead of something that is like we get more information. So we ask them, this is an example of a group I was working with teaching writing. But the north point is, what do I need to know? Where the south is like, what do I believe? The E is, what excites you or energizes you. And the W is worrisome. So we're kind of thinking about the points of the compass and like orienting ourselves and reflecting. So this is what it looked like with that group. It was a group of K-8 teachers at a private school I was working with. And I did this at the start of the workshop day that we had together. And then as they went through at the end, they added sticky notes that solidified some of their beliefs. And so some of the things that I learned while looking at this is a lot of them saw writing as like a task or an assignment or some sort of like project they did, not necessarily a unit. So it helped me better gauge how I'm going to present information and guide them through this work. But it also saw, they really are excited and energized by writing. So I was able to see like, okay, they like it when it's engaging. They just haven't fit that with their beliefs yet. And you can see a lot of them added to their beliefs by the end of that session. So that's an example of how I would do that with a whole group. But I've also done it with grade level teams. And so this is one for reading, and each grade level team completed one. And we keep these charts. And so I continually work with these teams actually, and we grow these throughout the year. So we started with this as a baseline, and then we use this to set goals. So we actually looked across, did a gallery walk, looked across all of them. And as a team of teachers, K4, or actually it's pre-K4, we decided, okay, what is consistent on our campus? Like, what do we believe as a campus? And that helps us create things like our literacy vision. And then we could set some goals based on those things that we need. So this group in particular, they were like, I just don't know how to do goal setting. Like, I don't know how to get the kids to set their own goals beyond a reading level. And so the first professional development I'm doing with them actually in 2 weeks is on goal setting. And how does this look like with students inside the classrooms? And so it helps us just kind of funnel again into what is really needed by our teachers. So that is a very informal way. And so if you haven't seen Project Zero, they have so many good thinking routines, and I love using these with students and also teachers. This is where the compass activity came from. And so it's not something I created out of thin air. It's something that's really grounded in a protocol for helping facilitate thinking and discussion. Of course, I've used it different ways based on the situation. So if you haven't used this website, I would bookmark it. So when you do professional development or something in the future with your teachers, you can introduce it with them by using it to scaffold that learning and facilitate conversations. But it's also a tool they can come back to their class with and do it with students, because it is written with students in mind. So the point of the compass activity, and the reason why I like it, is it's really like, it's not about me as a leader. Like, I'm not positioning myself as the focal point. I'm really trying to shift it onto our students, our teachers' needs. And so even though I'm in the role of, a consultant or a leader in literacy, it's really not about that. It's about making a difference with the kids in the school. And so the compass activity I have found to just invite that conversation in a more authentic and organic manner, whereas some of the other surveys can feel really contrived and forced and inauthentic. And it also puts you in this position of like, oh gosh, what is she going to do with this data? Where the compass activity, they don't really worry about that. In fact, we leave it up in the coaches room. So every time I come back, we reference it, and I can see that they have continually added to it as I've been gone. So just think about positioning yourself. Like, how do I position myself so that I am a member of the team rather than the person just driving the bus? So there are some formal measures, and I encourage you to try both if you can. Either one will work. Honestly, we're just collecting information. This class is about, playing with these structures, not doing it perfectly. But with formal measures, we do have to introduce the purpose. We have to really think about like setting that information. We collect demographic information so we know who's, putting in the responses. And we really shoot for like 10 to 15 questions. So this is more like a survey. We think about wording our questions in a way that's not leading. And so sometimes we say things like, a Likert scale of, a statement with like strongly agree to strongly disagree. So that way we can kind of gauge it, not leading them into, say, a particular thing. And we also want to make sure we give an opportunity for them to have open feedback. So there's place for both of these measures inside of your work with teachers. I think that it's all about balance. So an example here of what this might look like is you can see it gives a quick description at the top. It's that scale, still the Likert scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And I actually really like the 0 where it's haven't experienced. And then they score it based on these descriptions. So there's things like the district has a set literacy goal. So like if you don't know that, you might put a 0. And of course, whatever these questions are is depending on what your focus is. So if your focus is alignment with curriculum, these questions might be most appropriate. If your questions are more about analyzing student work, we might have some different questions. I really like tools like Qualtrics. So you probably have heard of Google Forms or Microsoft Forms or even SurveyMonkey. We have access to a paid subscription to Qualtrics that you can have access to as a student. The reason I like this, well, there's a couple of reasons, but the first reason is it's free and it's super user friendly. It's so easy to design, and they have a lot of surveys already created that you can borrow from. The other reason I like it is it's 100% anonymous, so it doesn't take teacher information at all. And so that with a Google form, if their name's going on it, sometimes their response might change. But with this, like there isn't a way. I mean, I'm sure there's a way that someone in the tech world could figure out how to like track an IP address or something like that, but we're not going to do that. So rest assured that it's anonymous. The other thing about it is you can see the breakdown. This is a graph that's actually presented from Qualtrics. So you can print a report and an analysis of all of the questions. So it's just easier to interpret. So this is an example of a student from last semester in the spring. So you can see she has a quick description of what she's doing. And then this is an example of the question she asked and how her participants responded. So it tells you how many responses you got and then the breakdown. So with this one, she asked the question about like, how prepared are you to teach student with dyslexia? And you can see a big majority of them said disagree. 42%. So a lot of her campus improvement plan then was targeted towards dyslexia and making sure our teachers felt prepared to support that. So really, it's not about us, it's about finding the potential and the things around us on our campus. So we're using this information, whether it's formal or informal measures, to just move the campus forward. So then we need to think about triangulating our findings with existing data. So this looks a couple different ways. We will gather information from our learning walk, and I'm recording a separate slideshow with that like that specifically, because that's a very particular piece of this puzzle. So we're going to think about, okay, what did we find out from this information? And then what are we actually noticing when we walk the campus? Then we can also look at campus assessment data. So this could be things like formative assessment measures, but it also could be things like our universal screening tools. I know a lot of you use MClass or the BAS system to get a reading level on a student. All of these assessment tools can help us see like, okay, if our teachers, I'll give you an example actually at this campus that said they really wanted to set goals. That was a pre-K, and actually most teachers did that, but the kinder team was really worried about like, how do I do this in a meaningful way with a 5-year-old? And then when we looked at their learning or their data from their BAS scores from the year before, so this is like who's coming into first grade, like the beginning of your first grade, their students from the previous year, they had like 60% of their kids who were reading below a level D. And so we had a really important conversation of like, okay, if this is what our reading assessment data is looking for, like, let's look at ways to set goals with kids and measure that so that we don't have this next year, so that we can push them forward, recognizing our population of students. Most of them are coming in without their letters and sounds. And so we're celebrating huge gains that are happening there. But what incremental changes can we make so that number can shrink over time? And so it's just, instead of just using one source of data or targeting one specific team, having conversations across all the data to drive some of that work. And finally, the state assessments, which I think take with a grain of salt, but we know that's one day, one measure in time, but it is important to look at. So sometimes we notice that like third grade struggles a lot, but then when we compare it with our campus assessment data, some of that stuff is inflated. So it's like, okay, why is this not transitioning to state assessment data? Um, what do we need to do to up the rigor of our assessments to match our state assessment data with the format that it is? So there's just ways we can have conversations that are more meaningful when we compare more than one source of data. So an example of this that another student did last semester was she did their MAP scores. And so she just kind of talked about, okay, here's where they are in this area. And you can see, you can kind of take a glance at this to see what's happening in second grade specifically. And then she compared it to what she found in the needs assessment. And she ended up targeting phonics because she saw this big need coming into second grade. So then we have to think about our literacy programs we're using to drive our curriculum. So there's been a lot of debate over this. A lot of campuses are using programs that aren't grounded in evidence. And that is a couple of ways. So we have to look at it through a critical lens. So it could be that there's not a lot of research evidence in the program itself, but it's grounded in evidence-based practice. And so that's when we can say, all right, well, it's using things like reader's theater, and we know that's grounded in this type of practice, or it's using word sorts, and that's grounded in this type of evidence-based practice. And so it could be that it's compiled of evidence-based practices. A good example of this is the Fountas and Purnell classroom system. So this is a brand new program, so they don't have a lot of evidence that is really examine the effectiveness of that particular classroom system. Plus, there's a lot of different components and variables. Sometimes teachers, just get access to one piece of it. And so that could be a reason. And so that's a really good example of, even though we might not have a study that says how effective it is as a program, we do know that there's some pieces in there that are grounded in evidence. And then we want to look at the effectiveness. So their LLI system, for example, that has been studied as an intervention method through What Works Clearinghouse, and has been seen to have some flaws. And so we could use that to think about, is there a way that we can have a conversation about a method that would work a little bit better for our students? I say this with take this with a grain of salt, because things like Education Week have published a lot of things. Like, you can see these articles over here are all about the Teachers College resources. And they're citing things that are actually not true in some cases, because it's not What Works Clearinghouse. So What Works Clearinghouse takes like a meta-analysis of a bunch of different studies to talk about the effectiveness for that program, where Education Week has sometimes just had opinion pieces, or New York Times has had opinion pieces about things. And so we just want to make sure that we're having an opportunity to explore counter arguments. So we're not just reading those in favor, but also reading those against. Or if we have really set opinions about a particular curriculum, we're looking at the counter argument for that opinion to form a more neutral stance. I think right now with social media, a lot of opinions are shared. I know even on TikTok, you can get these things that it's like, well, it's X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, oh, actually, that's not it at all. I'm not really sure that you've even looked at the curriculum. And so it's important to go in with a critical lens. So we do need to make sure it's grounded in evidence-based practice, and we do need to look for that effectiveness, because if there is something that says it's ineffective for kids, our kids deserve something better or a component added in that would enhance whatever was missing. But also taking time to look through both sides of an issue to come to a middle, because they're going to have people on both sides in your campus. And as a leader, honestly, the hardest part is just muting our opinion, because it's really not about what we think. It's about guiding what's best for our campus and making sure that the people that are, teaching our kids don't feel defeated. And so even with the kindergarten team, to hear that data, it was emotional, and I anticipated it being emotional. But one of the things that we had discovered on our learning walk was that they were doing a lot of play-based centered, what I actually really loved. It was one of my favorite parts of the day. A lot of Play-Doh and things that was just like the rigor was not quite there, but it's an important skill because their kids were coming in with like lack of fine motor skills, their attention span, they needed that motor break. And so the teacher was saying, I felt like at this point of the day, they just need that break. And I was like, oh, I totally get that. And so when we're talking about the data and when we're talking about the effectiveness of things like centers, instead of saying cut out stations, we're not doing that anymore as a district, because that's not going to help anybody. Instead, I phrased it like this. I said, your team values play-based learning. And I think that is a characteristic that makes you so strong, and it's so important for the population that you're serving. Let's look at our schedule and see how we can distribute that type of learning, and how we might be able to look at the opportunities within that independent practice so students are doing work that pushes them as readers rather than just the fine motors thing. And so all we had to do was look at our classroom schedule and think about, okay, our science time, could we put some of this in there where we're talking about a science activity and putting some pieces in there, like even things like when we talk about leaves, having opportunities to cut and to copy, I forget what you call that, but when you get the mold and you color over it, things like that are really important for kids to experience. But is there another time of day? The other time we talked about was morning. And when they're coming in, how can we use this as a soft start? They had already had STEM buckets kind of in their rotation. So I said, could we add one of these things as our morning routine and then just extend that independent reading time? So it's not about throwing practices out because we find it's ineffective. It's about figuring out where are we so we can add incremental changes that don't feel like teachers are having to overhaul their curriculum. And a lot of that goes back to how we present that information to them. And so this is an example of what Works Clearinghouse has. This is actually from Lexia. When you click on the report on what Works Clearinghouse, and we'll get to this in the literacy program analysis, but I thought it was worth mentioning here because this is kind of like where we're going. This tells you what the effects were. So it says Lexia reading was found to have potentially positive effects, but no discernible effects on fluency, potentially positive effects on comprehension, and no discernible effects on general reading achievement. So if my campus is using Lexia and my teachers are saying, okay, I feel like they know their alphabet and they're really thinking about text, but like fluency, like I'm not getting that from this program, then I have this triangulation data to say like, okay, maybe we can add in readers theater or something like that. So we can just use this to better drive our conversation with data in mind. So from all of that, we synthesize to determine some patterns and trends. So we're going to think about what are the overall strengths of our campus. So like I said earlier, like kindergarten team, like play-based learning in a way that's meaningful, not just like the, go play in a play center type of thing, but like really incorporating some of these fine motor skills. Like we really think about a lot of different types of learning needs. And building on that. So then what are our needs? Okay, our students are making the reading growth that they need to make, especially in first grade when we have so many levels that they're having to, complete that year or progress through, rather, would be a better way to say that. So how do we meet those needs? So our needs are that the students, there's this gap here. So what incremental changes can we make that's going to have the biggest difference for our kids? And we really want to pull our teachers in on this decision-making process. So it's not us imposing a plan, but collaboratively coming together to do that. And so I really like to do this at the beginning of the year so that throughout the year we have like tangible steps. So for example, with this team, I'm meeting with them like 3 or 4 times between the end of September and the end of October. So we'll meet pretty weekly inside of their classroom to coach them through it. And then I knew that November, December, it's kind of hard to be in there as a coach. January, they're collecting new assessment data. So then we're going to meet in February to figure out, okay, how much growth did we see between our beginning of year assessments and our mid-year assessments? And are the patterns still the same? Are we seeing some gaps closing based on what are the things we've done? And then we're going to layer on that. So small tangible changes. And I actually have a 3-year plan where it's not just this year that we're working, but like, what is next year going to look like? What is the next year going to look like? So that way it's not just so much to take on in one school year, especially right now when we have like reading academies and all these other pieces of like things being imposed on us. We want it to feel really organic and authentic to their work. Then we take off. And this is really where we're setting some goals for improvement. So that multi-year plan. So we start with our goals. Where are we going? And we go into strategies of how are we going to get there? So if my goal is to close this gap between kinder and first grade, that's happening. How are we going to get there? So the first thing I'm doing with this team is goal setting with kids. What does that look like with a child that's not just level based? Or sometimes you see teachers do like words correct per minute. Like we're not going to do that. We're going to set goals on like really meaningful work with reading. And we're also at the same time to meet that goal, we're going to look at our classroom libraries. What resources do kids have access to improve their reading? Are they having text that they can actually read independently? What are some of the small group structures that exist? Are we just doing guided reading, or are there opportunities to do some more strategy-based grouping? Are the only texts we're using for small groups leveled readers, or do we have access to some decodable readers? Are we helping students make transitions between reading and writing? And so we're actually looking at interactive writing and the power of that. So we might have one goal, but there's multiple strategies of how we're going to get there. And then us as coaches, we layer it for them. So while we know the way, we want to make sure we're showing our teachers that way. And so we do this by creating some action steps. So we have incremental steps over time. So in your first year, I set steps kind of like I was saying before, it's like quarterly, where it's like, okay, in September, I know I have this data source, so I'm going to do this. In the middle of the year, I might do this. So you could have like it at 3 points of the year, or even as your grading periods progress. And really thinking about who do I need involved. So for example, in this photo, when we did our learning walk, I had the campus administration come with me on the learning walk, along with one representative from each grade level. And we visited pre-K through 4th grade. And we talked to readers. We really got in there because I needed everybody on the same page before we moved forward. So think through who's going to need to be in on those meetings, so it's not just you alone. And then develop a timeline. This is kind of like our roadmap. It's very flexible. We're not saying that it's something that has to be set in stone. We can adapt it, but like, how are we going to put professional learning experiences across time, across the campus? And again, this is getting deeper into our campus improvement plan, but I want you to see how we're taking the needs assessment for this bigger purpose. So for example, this is a part of a campus improvement plan from last year, where there was one goal of like 3 or 4. So this is just one piece of it. And so she really wanted, this is the one that found the need for dyslexia support. And so, she wanted some more phonological awareness training, and they have specific curriculum that supports it. And so she has goals for each quarter of what's going to happen specifically with that. And from all of that, then we think about, okay, what do we need to look for in our classrooms? Like what are we gonna measure to see that this is happening? So for example, in the kindergarten class, I might look for evidence of teacher note-taking. I might look at student goal folders. I might look at their classroom libraries to see what type of books are available. So how are we gonna know that when we're in a classroom, this is what it should look like? And again, this is an example, actually from a team that we worked with. Actually, they were in Hawaii working with their teachers, and a group of coaches came together to create a rubric of what it looks like. So they started with like, what is the highest level of implementation, kind of like T-Test does, and then they scaled it back. But it's not deficit language, it's very much more like a progression of skills. So while we're shooting for, during conferring the teacher doing that, the layer back, they're still doing pieces of it. So they together created the look for. And so you will do that too in your campus improvement plan. It doesn't have to be a rubric. It could also be just a checklist of like, what you'll see in our classrooms is X, Y, and Z. So, the goal of this needs assessment is really to drive our campus improvement plan and help us set those goals and action steps, the timeline to look for. But really, we have to think about as a leader, listening with the same passion we feel about being heard. And so, it's not about our voice, it's about highlighting the voices of those doing the work and being their advocate so things can start changing and improving over time.